Deborah tore my house down for 8 parking spaces, not by mistake, on purpose. She knew the floorboards hid something. In 1849, 11 people crouched in that 4-foot-high cellar for 6 days while dogs and slave catchers sniffed the wood above them. She wanted the land. Now the room is open to the sky, and the state has just made what she did a crime. I'm Marcus Flint. That farmhouse stood on my family's land since 1842. My great-great-grandfather built the cellar himself to shelter runaways on the Underground Railroad. Deborah Whitmore didn't care. As HOA president of Ridgeline Heights, she'd spent 3 years trying to seize my lot for a parking expansion. When I refused to sell, she called the structure a safety hazard, hired a demolition crew, and took a wrecking ball to 180 years of history. The state's new felony charge is just the first volley in a war nobody saw coming. That war started 3 years ago, the afternoon I received a certified letter on Ridgeline Heights Homeowners Association letterhead. It was January 12th, and I'd just finished shoveling snow off the farmhouse porch. Deborah Whitmore informed me my property had been designated a community nuisance under HOA Covenant 7.4. The clapboard siding needed paint. The stone foundation showed weathering. The barn roof sagged. She gave me 60 days to complete $15,000 in renovations or face a fine of $200 per day, accruing until the violations were corrected. The letter CC'd the Boulder County Code Enforcement Office and the Ridgeline Heights Architectural Review Committee, which Deborah chaired. Her signature sat at the bottom in dark purple ink, loops so aggressive they nearly tore the paper. I called the number on the letterhead. Deborah answered on the first ring. She knew exactly who I was before I spoke. "Mr. Flint," she said, "I hope you read the covenant carefully. This isn't about aesthetics. Your property sits directly adjacent to our new community pool and fitness center. The board feels it lowers property values." Then she made an offer. $60,000 cash for the half-acre lot, the house to be demolished at my expense. If I refused, the fines would eventually exceed the property's worth, and the HOA could place a lien against the title. I hung up without responding. That's when I began to understand this wasn't a dispute over peeling paint. This was a land grab dressed in legal paperwork. Now, to understand why $60,000 was an insult, you need to know what sat beneath those floorboards. My great-great-grandfather, Josiah Flint, was a Connecticut-born abolitionist who moved west in 1841 to escape the violence that trailed anyone preaching emancipation. He bought 50 acres of timberland, built the farmhouse with his own hands, and then did something that could have gotten him imprisoned or killed. He excavated a cellar beneath the main room, 3 feet below grade, and lined it with hand-chiseled sandstone blocks. The entrance was a trapdoor hidden under a braided wool rug, later replaced by a kitchen hutch bolted to the floor. There were no windows, no ventilation shaft. The only way in or out was through a narrow ladder Josiah could pull up from above. In 1849, 11 freedom seekers hid in that room for 6 days while slave catchers and their dogs searched the property twice. The local sheriff, who'd been paid to assist, walked directly over the trapdoor and never noticed it. That room saved 11 lives. The historicity wasn't rumor. In 1997, the National Park Service's Network to Freedom program formally verified the site. A bronze plaque was installed on the front gate. School groups visited. I kept a guest book that by 2020 contained signatures from descendants of 3 of the 11 people who hid there. One of them, a woman named Angela Carver from Atlanta, wrote, "My grandfather's grandfather was a toddler in this room. Thank you for keeping it safe." The property was listed on the Colorado State Register of Historic Properties. It was eligible for the National Register, and Deborah Whitmore wanted to pave it over for 8 parking spaces. But here's the thing about a listing on a state register. It doesn't prevent demolition unless the property is also a locally designated landmark. Boulder County didn't have that designation in place for my farmhouse because nobody had ever filed the paperwork. I'd assumed the state listing offered protection. It offered recognition only. A property owner can still do whatever they want with their own land, and the HOA covenant, written decades before the historic designation, didn't exempt historic structures. Deborah knew this. She'd done her research. When the 60-day deadline expired, the fines began. $200 a day, every day, deposited into an escrow account controlled by the Ridgeline Heights HOA. By April, I owed $12,000. By June, $24,000. I couldn't afford the renovations she demanded, and I couldn't afford the fines. I tried to negotiate a compromise. I offered to place a conservation easement on the property that would preserve the seller in perpetuity if the HOA dropped the covenant enforcement. Deborah's attorney, a man named Brian Kempner, responded with a single-sentence letter. Ms. Whitmore's offer to purchase remains $60,000, now adjusted to account for fines accrued. It was a vice. She was squeezing me toward financial collapse, so I'd have no choice but to sell. Then came the anonymous tips. In July, Boulder County Animal Control arrived after a report that I was keeping dangerous dogs on the property. I don't own dogs. In August, the fire marshal inspected the house based on a complaint of illegal electrical wiring. He found nothing. In September, Child Protective Services showed up with a report that my daughter Emma was living in unsafe conditions. She was 22 and lived in Fort Collins. Each visit was logged, each complaint clearly fabricated, but the cumulative effect was exhaustion. Deborah wasn't just after my land. She was trying to break me psychologically so I'd walk away. What she didn't know was that I'd started documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every county visit. I kept a digital recorder running during conversations. I took time-stamped photographs of my property twice a week, proving there was no debris, no code violations, no reason for any of it. I hired a structural engineer to assess the house, and he produced a 47-page report certifying it was sound. I stored multiple copies of the deed, the original land grant from 1842, the tax receipts going back a century and a half, and the Network to Freedom verification letter in a safe deposit box 30 miles away. My grandfather, William Flint, had fought off land speculators in the 1970s with exactly this kind of obsessive record-keeping. I was simply continuing the family tradition. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in November. I was driving back from the hardware store when my neighbor, a woman named Carol who'd lived next to the farmhouse for 40 years, called my cell phone. Her voice was shaking. "Marcus," she said, "you need to get home right now. There's a wrecking ball parked in your front yard." By the time I pulled onto Old Mill Road, the demolition crew was already setting up. A white Range Rover sat at the curb. Deborah Whitmore stood beside it, arms crossed, wearing the same expression of mild satisfaction I'd seen on her face in every HOA meeting photograph. She obtained an emergency demolition permit from the county, citing imminent collapse risk. The permit was time-stamped 9:17 a.m. that morning. I didn't receive a single notice, not a call, not a letter. The county commissioner who signed off on it was Victor Hastings, a man whose re-election campaign had received $47,000 in donations from a political action committee controlled by Deborah's husband, Preston Whitmore. It all began to make a terrifying kind of sense. I parked my truck and started running toward the house, but a sheriff's deputy blocked my path. Not just any deputy, Deputy Torres, the same officer who'd shown up to every complaint Deborah had filed against me for 3 years. "Sir," he said, "this is a legal operation. You can't interfere." The wrecking ball swung. It hit the east wall of the farmhouse at 11:43 a.m. and the sound was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't wood breaking. It was history being erased in chunks. In 15 minutes, the kitchen was gone. By noon, the second floor collapsed into the first. And then the wrecking ball punched through the floor of what had been the main room, and for a moment everything stopped. A hole opened in the earth, and there it was. The cellar, 4 feet high, sandstone walls, the ladder still propped against the interior ledge. Open to the sky for the first time in 177 years. I broke past Torres. I don't remember doing it. I remember standing at the edge of that hole with my phone out, recording as the foreman shouted for the crew to halt. Somebody called 911. Somebody else called a local news station. By 2:00 p.m., Patricia Hughes from Channel 9 Denver was on site with a camera crew. By 5:00 p.m., the video had gone viral. 11 million views in the first night. Deborah Whitmore issued a statement calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. She said she'd been unaware of the seller's historical significance. Despite the bronze plaque on the gate, and the documentation, I'd mailed her 14 times. Nobody believed her. The public outrage forced the state attorney general's office to open an investigation. Within 2 weeks, they found something extraordinary, a previously obscure state statute from 1907, Title 24, Article 80, subsection 101.3, which made it a Class 4 felony to knowingly destroy a verified site associated with the Underground Railroad. The law had been passed after a similar incident in Denver and then forgotten, never enforced. Until now. On the day charges were filed, Deborah Whitmore was arrested in her driveway. Her mugshot trended nationally, but this is not a story about a Karen who faced consequences. This is a story about what happened after the arrest. Because when the state's forensic archaeology team began excavating the cellar, they found something in the rubble that nobody expected. Something that would prove Deborah Whitmore's crime was far worse than demolishing a historic house. Something that would connect her directly to a cover-up that spanned decades, and that would finally answer a question historians had been asking for 177 years. What else had been hidden beneath my great-great-grandfather? Floorboards. The forensic team arrived on a Wednesday morning, led by a woman named Dr. Estelle Vernon, the state's chief historical archaeologist. She was 63 years old with steel-gray hair and the kind of quiet authority that made sheriff's deputies step aside without being asked. She excavated pre-Columbian sites in Mesa Verde, recovered bodies from the killing fields in Cambodia, and once identified a 12th century Viking settlement in Newfoundland using nothing but soil discoloration and a dental pick. Now she stood at the edge of the hole in my destroyed farmhouse, peering down at the sandstone walls like a surgeon examining a wound. The crew set up floodlights and a grid system. For the first 2 days, they excavated the debris layer, broken beams, plaster fragments, shards of my grandmother's china. Standard demolition aftermath. But on the 3rd day, one of the grad students, a young man with dirt-caked headphones around his neck, called Dr. Vernon over with a tremble in his voice. He'd uncovered something beneath the cellar floor. Not the floor I knew, the one I'd walked on during school tour, the one covered in wide oak planks Josiah had laid. Beneath that, a second, older floor made of tightly fitted flagstones, sealed with mortar that had oxidized to the color of dried blood over 150 years. And under that, a cavity. The crew spent another day carefully removing the flagstones. What emerged was a rectangular pit, roughly 3 feet by 6 feet, lined with the same sandstone as the cellar walls. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had turned brittle as old paper, were 2 objects that changed everything. The first was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed but legible. The handwriting was my great-great-grandfather. I recognized it from the land grant and the family Bible. But this wasn't a farm journal or a book of sermons. It was a record of names, not just the 11 people everyone knew about, but dozens of them, carefully dated from 1843 to 1854. Josiah had documented every freedom seeker who passed through the cellar, where they came from, who was pursuing them, and where they were headed next. The last entry was dated July 18, 1854. Then the ledger stopped, mid-sentence. The second object was a rusted iron strongbox, the kind used to store deeds and currency in the 19th century. Dr. Vernon opened it with tools that looked like they belonged in a surgical theater. Inside were 3 things: a stack of abolitionist newspapers printed in Boston and smuggled west, a revolver with 4 of its 6 chambers still loaded, and a folded sheet of vellum covered in spidery script. This was not my great-great-grandfather's handwriting. This document was a confession, signed by a man named Harlan Whitmore, dated 1854. Harlan Whitmore, the ledger would later confirm, was a bounty hunter hired by a Missouri slaveholder named Cyrus de Groot to track down 11 runaways who'd escaped his plantation in the spring of 1849. Those 11 people were the same 11 who hid in my cellar for 6 days. Harlan Whitmore had followed their trail across the Missouri border, through Kansas territory, and into the foothills of Colorado. He'd arrived at the farmhouse on the 7th day after the group had already moved on, but he didn't leave empty-handed. The confession described, in excruciating detail, What happened next? Harlan confronted Josiah on the front porch of the farmhouse. He demanded to know where the runaways had been taken. Josiah refused to speak. So Harlan beat him, dragged him to the cellar, and when Josiah still wouldn't talk, he shot him in the head. Then he buried the body in the very pit beneath the flagstone floor where the ledger and strongbox were later hidden. He wrote the confession out of guilt. He claimed, after returning to Missouri a broken man. He sealed it in the strongbox, along with the revolver, and he never spoke of it again. The forensic team took soil samples from the pit. DNA analysis confirmed human remains beneath the flagstones. Further excavation, which required ground-penetrating radar and a full archaeological exhumation, recovered a partial skeleton. The skull had a bullet hole above the left eye socket. Dental records didn't exist in 1854, but the location, the confession, and the family history left no doubt. Josiah Flint had been murdered on his own property, and his killer had buried him in the very room designed to save lives. Dr. Vernon's team released their initial findings at a press conference covered by every major national news outlet. But here, where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming, the confession, when authenticated by a forensic documents examiner, included a detail that connected Harlan Whitmore directly to present-day Deborah Whitmore. The document listed Harlan's descendants, a son named Amos, a grandson named Cornelius, a great-grandson named Ronald, and a great-great-granddaughter named Deborah. She wasn't just some random HOA president with a parking expansion fetish. She was the direct descendant of the man who murdered my ancestor, and she knew. This wasn't speculation. During discovery in my civil suit against Whitmore Development, my attorney, Lydia Chen, subpoenaed Deborah's personal emails. Buried among thousands of messages about pool maintenance and landscape design was a chain from 2019, 2 years before the demolition. Deborah had hired a genealogist to trace her family history. The genealogist's report, attached as a PDF, outlined Harlan Whitmore's criminal history in Colorado Territory, including a warrant issued for his arrest in 1855 that was never served. The report flagged the Flint farmhouse specifically, noting that property records showed a Whitmore forefather had visited the site the day Josiah was last seen alive. The genealogist even referenced the network to Freedom Plaque and suggested that the cellar might contain forensic evidence of Harlan's crime. Deborah's response to that email, sent to her husband Preston, read, "We need to acquire that property immediately." If anyone ever connects Harlan to the Flint murder, the whole family reputation is destroyed. Offer double the land value, hire the lawyer, do whatever it takes, just get rid of that house. She didn't just want parking spaces, she wanted to erase the evidence. And when I refused to sell, she escalated. Covenant violations, the fines, the anonymous tips to code enforcement and CPS, the manufactured emergency demolition permit. It was all designed to eliminate the one physical location where her family's blood-stained history could be proven. She calculated that if the house was rubble, the cellar would be filled in and paved over. The ledger, the strongbox, the bones, the confession, they'd be locked beneath asphalt forever. She almost got away with it. The state attorney general upgraded the charges. Deborah Whitmore was now facing not just the Class 4 felony for demolishing a historic Underground Railroad site, but felony tampering with physical evidence, conspiracy to commit historical desecration, and under a novel legal theory, accessory after the fact to a murder committed 177 years earlier. That last charge was largely symbolic. There's no statute of limitations on murder, but an accessory charge requires an underlying prosecution, and Harlan Whitmore was long dead. Still, the symbolism mattered. The criminal complaint stated, for the first time in American legal history, that the destruction of an Underground Railroad site constituted an ongoing harm to the descendants of enslaved people whose history was being systematically erased. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund offered to co-counsel with my attorney. The story had become a national reckoning on preservation, race, and the violent legacy still buried under suburban subdivisions. But there was another revelation yet to come. one that would implicate far more than a single HOA president, because the ledger named names, not just of the enslaved people who passed through the cellar, but of the people who helped them along the next leg of the journey. Station masters in other towns, conductors who carried messages, safe houses from Boulder to the Canadian border. If Josiah's ledger was authentic, it didn't just document my ancestors' heroism. It rewrote the map of the abolitionist network in the American West, adding dozens of previously unknown locations to the historical record. And one of those locations was the original land parcel on which Ridgeline Heights now stood. The subdivision wasn't just built over a parking lot. It was built directly on top of a network of underground tunnels that predated the houses by 150 years. Tunnels that were still there. Dr. Vernon's next announcement would upend everything. She'd found structural anomalies beneath the Ridgeline Heights community pool. The ground-penetrating radar showed voids. When the asphalt was cut open, the digging revealed a stone passage, 4 feet high and lined with timber shoring. It ran east to west for at least 200 yards, connecting what had once been the Flint farmhouse cellar to a barn that no longer existed. And in that tunnel, the team found something that made my great-great-grandfather's ledger look like a footnote. But that discovery belongs to the next chapter of this story. Inside that tunnel, the archaeology team found a space that had been sealed for over a century and a half. It wasn't just a passage. It was a room hollowed out of the earth, supported by hand-hewn beams that still smelled faintly of pine pitch. And inside that room were 14 wooden bunks, each one covered in the remnants of straw mattresses. On the walls, hundreds of lines of charcoal writing, names, dates, prayers, and messages from the people who'd sheltered there. This was a major station on the Underground Railroad, not merely a single family's hiding spot. It was a hub. And it connected to a network of other tunnels that, according to ground-penetrating radar, extended beneath half the houses in Ridgeline Heights. The implications were staggering. Every one of those 96 homes sat atop documented, verifiable historic sites. Federal law is clear. Any property that contains or is eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places requires a full archaeological survey before construction. No survey was ever performed. Whitmore Development had skipped the environmental and historical reviews, a violation of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and Boulder County had rubber-stamped the permits anyway. The county commissioner who'd signed off on the demolition, Victor Hastings, now faced his own investigation, not just for the fraudulent emergency permit on my farmhouse, but for a pattern of overlooking reviews for Whitmore projects in exchange for campaign contributions. But here's where it gets worse. When the tunnel room was fully excavated, the team discovered a second strongbox, much larger than the one hidden beneath my cellar floor. This one was nailed shut with iron spikes. Inside were more ledgers, these belonging not to Josiah Flint, but to the station master who'd operated the hub, a freedman named Samuel Carver. Samuel had been born enslaved in Kentucky, purchased his own freedom in 1838, and moved west to work as a blacksmith. Secretly, he used his forge to create the ironwork for the tunnel reinforcements. His ledgers were a meticulous record of every person who passed through the Ridgeline network between 1842 and 1860. But they also contained something else, a list of informants who'd been paid to betray the stations. And at the top of that list, written in Samuel's careful script, was a name, Harlan Whitmore. Harlan hadn't just been a bounty hunter. He'd infiltrated the abolitionist network as a spy, posing as a sympathetic merchant while selling information to slaveholders in Missouri. He'd been paid for the location of the Flint cellar and the Carver tunnel. And when Josiah Flint confronted him with proof of his treachery, Harlan shot him. Samuel Carver's ledger described the confrontation, witnessed from a hidden alcove in the tunnel. Samuel had been too afraid to testify or even reveal his knowledge, for fear of his own life and the safety of everyone in the network. He'd buried the evidence in the tunnel, hoping that someday it would be found. So the story now had a second murder, albeit one we already knew about, but with a witness account and a documented motive. And the Whitmore family's culpability deepened into a multi-generational cover-up. The genealogists report that Deborah commissioned hadn't just flagged a possible murder. It had identified the spy ring, the betrayal, and the likelihood that Harlan's descendants had continued to benefit from his crimes. Preston Whitmore's real estate empire was built on land deals that traced back to properties originally acquired by Harlan using payoffs from slaveholders. The family's Aspen vacation home, the Denver office building, the Ridgeline Capital investment portfolio, all of it, directly or indirectly, had roots in blood money. My civil suit expanded to include a claim under Colorado's public nuisance law, seeking not just damages, but disgorgement of all profits derived from the tainted properties. The state attorney general joined the case, filing a parallel action to declare the Ridgeline Heights subdivision a historic preservation zone, which would prevent any further development and impose strict conservation easements on every lot. Homeowners learned that their property values might actually increase due to tax incentives for historic preservation, but many were terrified that they'd lose their homes altogether. Sarah Chen, the woman who'd called me crying after the first broadcast, organized a homeowner association separate from Deborah's HOA, the Ridgeline Heights Preservation Coalition. They voted unanimously to support the state's action and to name the tunnel network as a national historic landmark. Deborah was removed as HOA president by a court-appointed receiver. Her husband, Preston, was indicted on 14 counts of fraud and bribery. The entire Whitmore empire collapsed. But the ultimate revelation came when Dr. Vernon's team excavated beneath the foundation of the Whitmore family home itself, a sprawling mansion on the edge of the subdivision. There, in a sub-basement that wasn't on any building plans, they found a room filled with artifacts that Harlan Whitmore had systematically looted from underground railroad sites across 3 states. Shackles, diaries, freedom papers, quilts encoded with escape maps. It was a private museum of suffering, hidden by the family for 150 years. And in the center of the room, a portrait of Cyrus DeGroot, the Missouri slaveholder who'd financed Harlan's spy operation, along with a collection of letters between DeGroot and Harlan detailing payments for each person they'd recaptured. The letters revealed that Harlan hadn't acted alone in 1849. He'd had a local accomplice, someone who'd let him into the cellar, someone who'd held Josiah down while Harlan pulled the trigger. That accomplice's name was carved into a wooden beam in the tunnel room, along with a confession scratched in panic. I showed him the door. God forgive me. The name was partially eroded, but the state crime lab used laser scanning to reconstruct it. The name was Nathaniel Vance. Vance was a name everyone in Boulder County recognized, because he was Deborah Whitmore's maternal ancestor, and the Vance family had owned the quarry that provided the stone for the original Ridgeline farmhouse. The same quarry whose modern operations had supplied the gravel for the Ridgeline Heights roads. The same quarry whose CEO, a man named Arthur Vance, had personally signed the emergency demolition permit for my farmhouse as the county's planning director, who reported directly to Commissioner Hastings. The circle closed, every thread pulled taut. What began as an HOA Karen demolishing a historic house for parking had become a sprawling conspiracy involving 4 families, 2 murders, a slavery-era spy ring, and a century-and-a-half of land fraud. The federal investigation that followed led to the largest historic preservation enforcement action in American history. All 96 homes were retroactively protected, and a new museum was proposed on the site of the tunnel entrance, funded by the seized assets of Whitmore Development. My farmhouse would be rebuilt as a memorial, and the name of Josiah Flint, long forgotten, would finally be spoken in history books as a man who gave his life for the freedom of strangers. But the story isn't over, because the day the court issued its final judgment, I received another letter. This one wasn't from an HOA, it was from the Department of Justice, addressed to me as the legal representative of the Josiah Flint estate. They'd uncovered evidence that the Whitmore conspiracy had extended into the modern-day trafficking networks that still operate along the same routes as the historic Underground Railroad, and they wanted my help to trace how the infrastructure built for liberation had been twisted into a tool of exploitation. That's the story I'll tell you next. The Department of Justice letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. When I finally did, the contents shook me harder than the wrecking ball had. The task force had been investigating a modern human trafficking ring operating across Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri. The routes they used, rural roads, abandoned farmhouses, underground storage spaces, mirrored almost exactly the Underground Railroad routes documented in Josiah's ledger. The traffickers were exploiting the same geography, the same secrecy, the same desperation that had defined the 1840s. Only now, the people being moved weren't escaping slavery. They were being forced into it. I agreed to assist. Lydia negotiated an agreement with the U.S. attorney that gave me full immunity from any legal exposure and allowed me to serve as a historical consultant. Over the next 8 months, I worked with federal agents to overlay Josiah's maps onto modern satellite imagery. The hidden tunnel under Ridgeline Heights turned out to connect to 3 other properties, all of them owned by shell companies traced back to Whitmore affiliates. The DOJ raided those properties in a coordinated operation that made national headlines. They rescued 47 people. They arrested 19 traffickers, including 2 former county officials who'd taken bribes from Preston Whitmore years earlier. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. What began as a greedy HOA president trying to seize a half-acre lot had unraveled a network of exploitation that had persisted for decades, hiding in plain sight, protected by the same wealth and power that had protected Harlan Whitmore a century and a half before. The trials took 2 years. Deborah Whitmore, facing multiple felony convictions, accepted a plea deal that required her to forfeit all assets, serve 12 years in state prison, and permanently dissolve Ridgeline Capital. She cried at the sentencing hearing. She said she'd been trying to protect her family's reputation. The judge, a man named Harold Freeman, whose own grandfather had been a civil rights attorney in Selma, looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Reputation is what you earn, Ms. Whitmore. Legacy is what you leave. Yours is now part of the public record as a cautionary tale." Preston was convicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to 20 years. Commissioner Hastings pleaded guilty to bribery and served 18 months. Arthur Vance, the quarry CEO and planning director, was convicted of conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and sentenced to 5 years. The entire edifice collapsed. The Ridgeline Heights Preservation Coalition, led by Sarah Chen, raised $470,000 in private donations to fund the archaeological work and the construction of the memorial. The state legislature passed the Josiah Flint Underground Railroad Protection Act, which closed the loophole that had allowed Deborah to exploit the emergency demolition permit. It also created a new felony classification for the knowing destruction of any verified historic site associated with the abolitionist movement, with enhanced penalties for fraud or concealment. Governor Polis signed it into law at a ceremony held on the grounds of the rebuilt farmhouse. My daughter Emma spoke. She quoted Josiah's ledger, "The door is never locked, the lamp never extinguished, the road never ends." It's now inscribed on the granite monument outside the memorial. The farmhouse reconstruction took 14 months. Archaeologists salvaged every original timber, every fieldstone, every hand-forged nail that hadn't been pulverized. When they rebuilt the cellar, they left a glass panel in the floor so visitors could see the flagstones beneath which Josiah's bones had rested. The tunnel entrance was stabilized and opened for guided tour. The bunks in the hidden room were replicated based on Samuel Carver's ledger descriptions, and the charcoal writings were digitally preserved and displayed on interactive screens. The museum, a low-slung building of Colorado sandstone and reclaimed barn wood, opened on the anniversary of the demolition. 11 descendants of the original freedom seekers attended, including Angela Carver, who'd written in my guest book years earlier. She placed a wreath at the cellar door and said, "Now my children's children will know. They will stand in this room and feel what hope feels like." I live on the property again. The cabin I built on the remaining acreage is simple, 2 bedrooms, a porch that faces the mountains, a wood stove that smells like pinyon pine. I donated the 96 houses to the community trust, exactly as I'd promised, and the trust now manages the museum, the scholarship fund, and the preservation easements. The scholarship, named for Josiah and Samuel Carver jointly, has awarded 23 grants in its first 3 years to students studying archaeology, history, and civil rights law. Every year, on the anniversary of the demolition, the community gathers at the cellar for a candlelight vigil. Last year, a woman from Denver stood up during the open mic and said she discovered, through the museum's research, that her great-great-grandmother had been one of the 11 people hidden in 1849. She'd never known her family history. Now she brings her grandchildren. The story isn't just about land or law or history. It's about the invisible threads that connect the past to the present and how easily they can be severed if nobody's paying attention. Deborah Whitmore almost succeeded in paving over the truth. She had money, political influence, a network of complicit officials, and a generations-long head start on the cover-up. All it took to stop her was one person refusing to sell, one man who kept every receipt, one deed that survived fire and flood and fraud. And the network of people who came after, the archaeologists, the journalists, the attorneys, the homeowner coalition, multiplied that resistance into an unstoppable force. The final surprise came 2 weeks ago when the National Park Service announced a new designation. The Ridgeline Network is now a National Historic Landmark District, the largest underground railroad-related landmark west of the Mississippi. The designation protects not just the farmhouse cellar and the tunnel, but the entire landscape that supported the abolitionist movement in the Colorado Territory. It also unlocks federal funding for educational programs, preservation maintenance, and a traveling exhibit that will visit schools and libraries in 17 states. The exhibit's centerpiece is the actual strongbox, with Harlan Whitmore's confession still inside, displayed behind climate-controlled glass. And next to it, Josiah's ledger, open to the last page he ever wrote, a list of 11 names, and underneath the words, Godspeed, keep moving. Some people have asked me if I've forgiven Deborah Whitmore. I tell them forgiveness isn't mine to give. That belongs to the descendants of the people her ancestor hunted, and to the memory of Josiah Flint, whose voice was silenced by a bullet, but whose actions echo across 6 generations. What I can do is make sure the truth remains unburied. That's the work I'll be doing for the rest of my life. And if Deborah's case serves as a warning to anyone who thinks they can erase history with a wrecking ball and a campaign donation, then her legacy will be exactly the opposite of what she intended. She set out to destroy a hiding place. Instead, she revealed it to the world. Here's what this story is really about. It's not just one demolished house or one corrupt HOA president. It's what happens when someone decides that history is inconvenient, that the truth is too expensive to preserve, and that a pile of money can flatten anything in its path. For 177 years, Josiah Flint's cellar stayed hidden. It survived weather, neglect, and the passage of time. What it almost didn't survive was a woman with a wrecking ball and a family secret she was willing to bury under asphalt. And if I hadn't documented every violation, if I hadn't kept every tax receipt and every letter, if I hadn't stood at the edge of that hole with my phone recording, that room would be a parking lot today. Nobody would know what happened there. Nobody would know what else was hidden underneath. The question I want to leave you with is this: how many other places like this have already been lost? How many tunnels, how many cellars, how many rooms where desperate people prayed for freedom are now covered by strip malls and subdivisions? We'll never know the full number because for every site that gets saved, dozens more disappear without a trace. The only reason this one survived is because someone was watching. Someone kept receipts. That's the lesson. Documentation isn't just paperwork. It's ammunition. It's the thing that stands between a bulldozer and the truth. My grandfather told me, don't let the bastards take what's yours. Now I'll add something to that. Keep the receipts, every single one. Because someday, they might be the only thing that stops history from being erased. If you've ever faced an HOA nightmare, a property dispute, or someone who thought they could steamroll you because they had money and you had principles, drop your story in the comments. I read them. We're building something here, a community of people who understand that justice isn't automatic, it's fought for. And if this story mattered to you, if it reminded you that regular people can still win against impossible odds, hit that subscribe button. Next time, I'm telling you about a city council that denied my business permit, so I found a forgotten bylaw from the 1940s that made me untouchable. It's a story about outsmarting the system when the system was designed to crush you. See you then. Keep your receipts, all of them.